Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Jackson, and along with my co-director, Louisa Igloria, I'd like to welcome you to the 43rd Annual ODU Literary Festival. Our theme for this year's festival is Grit and Grace. Despite the pandemic, the show has gone on. As poet Maggie Smith reminded us last night, no matter how dark the beginning, the good dark before the dawn is the beginning of a new day. As always, before we begin our program, we'd like to offer thanks to our sponsors and others who have supported the festival: the Norfolk Commission on the Arts and Humanities, the Muse Writers Center, the Edie and Forrest P. White Endowment, the Gay Cultural Studies Program at ODU, the Women's Studies Department at ODU, College of Arts and Letters Dean Kent Sandstrom, and Executive Director for the Arts Cullen Strong, among many others. Special thanks to our colleagues in the Office of Community Engagement. Without them, the show really might not have gone on. And of course, none of this would be possible without the tireless efforts, tenacity, generosity, and vision of my co-director, Louisa Igloria. So thank you, Louisa, for all that you've done. At the end of today's reading, we'll have time for a few questions. So if you have questions for our reader, please type them into the Q&A box and we'll ask as many as we have time to do before the program ends. Now I'd like to invite to the virtual stage Wendell Ward, a graduate student in ODU's MFA Creative Writing Program, who will introduce our reader. Wendell, if you'll turn on your microphone and camera now.
Thank you, Catherine. I was thrilled when Catherine and Louisa asked me to participate in this year's literary festival, especially in this capacity, which is to introduce a writer whose two story collections I only recently discovered, but a writer whose work has quickly become very important to me. Because when I say discovered him, I mean just in the nick of time. Why? Because I needed to learn what he had to teach me at this exact moment in my writing life. My fellow fiction students may recall from our workshops that the characters in my own stories have sometimes been critiqued as unsympathetic, or worse, downright contemptible. This, of course, makes it difficult for readers to root for them as they pursue their desires. This is a vexing problem. How does one write characters that are true to life, characters that represent humanity in all of its complexity and contradiction, characters whose sometimes sinister impulses drive them to think and behave in ways that are unconventional at best, sociopathic at worst, characters whose violent and lascivious natures are at war with their more loving, purer selves? And I'm not ashamed to admit that it is these kinds of divided characters that I find most fascinating. So, how do you write characters whose shadows have taken over, at least temporarily, as they move towards change, and from page one, still invite your readers to connect with and invest in these outcasts who seek connection in an unwholesome world where there is carnage, yes, but also catharsis? Well, our featured guest today has the answers and is in fact a master at serving up characters who finger that fine membrane between their altruistic natures and their more dangerous instincts, all the while inspiring readers to genuinely care what happens to them. The result is gripping. And while I won't give away his secrets here in this introduction, I will tell you that the skill with which he brings his vivid and riveting characters to life, pushing this reader and many more, as the book reviews reveal, to the outer edge of their emotional experience, compels me to return again and again to his stories to see how he does it. So now, and I've always wanted to say this, without further ado, I give you my new favorite writer, Mr. Daniel Mueller. Welcome, Daniel.
Wendell, that was the loveliest introduction, I swear to God, I have ever received. Thank you so much. I hope the story that I'm going to read this afternoon measures up to the ones that you love so much. You never know. That is, as writers, we're always evolving. I hope you enjoy what I have to read today. Before I begin, I want to thank the entire audience for taking time out of your day to listen to me read, to take part in the Old Dominion University 43rd Annual Lit Fest. I want to thank Ashley, Emily, Ebony, Son. I want to thank Catherine Jackson and Louisa Iglesia. You all have worked extremely hard to pull off what seems just a seamless, meticulous event. So thank you very much. Wendell, I'll quote you when I say, without further ado, I'll begin reading to you a new short story, new for me. I published it first as an essay in Gargoyle magazine, and now it figures as the title story in the collection of stories that I'm putting together now. It's called The Way They Do in Movies. The Way They Do in Movies. In anticipation of astronauts stepping from their lunar module onto the Sea of Tranquility and ground that might some thought swallow them whole, Dr. Hidalgo, an OBGYN like my father, but unlike him, a bachelor who drove a Byzantine blue 1963 Porsche 911, set up his RV-8 Dynoscope in his front yard. It was manufactured by Criterion Corporation in Hartford, Connecticut. The ad for the RV-6 in the backs of my Classics Illustrated comic books, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexander Dumas, I'd often pondered over, wondering how anybody could afford its $194.95 price tag. Dr. Hidalgo's telescope was even stronger and more expensive. Its solid white optical tube as thick as a kettle drum, affixed by ring clamps to a counterweighted dual-axis motor mounted on an expandable aluminum tripod. It was state-of-the-art, an amateur stargazer's dream, and as Dr. Hidalgo alternated between fiddling with the azimuth adjustment knobs and peering through the finder scope, adults and children alike congregated around him for the chance to look through the eyepiece at the crescent moon just appearing in the twilight sky. To celebrate the Apollo 11 moon landing, our neighborhood on Fort Hood Army Base had thrown a block party, and beside me, our elbows touching, stood Virginia Nettle, her sun-streaked hair falling to the shoulder straps of her orange shift. She'd been in the same second grade class as me, and that morning after church, I'd pedaled my gold Stingray, a 5-speed with a stick shift between the banana seat and handlebars, the 1.5 miles from our olive green duplex on Marshall Street to her brown one on Fisher Avenue, crossing Tank Destroyer Boulevard on the way. What would happen when I got there, I didn't know. But I'd biked past her house enough times, hoping vainly for a glimpse of her, to know I had to do something, even if disrespecting the geographical parameters my parents had set for me could result in a spanking across my father's knee. The carport was empty when I arrived, but I waited across the street until her parents and she returned in their church clothes, and I greeted them on the drive. "Mr. and Mrs. Nettle," I said, having recited the words I would say to them in my head on the way there. "Virginia and I were both in Mrs. McIntyre's second grade class last year, and I'm here to invite her to a block party my neighborhood is throwing to celebrate the Apollo 11 moon landing." With the hair trigger temper of one used to quashing irritations, Virginia's father spun on wingtips that glinted in the sun. "That's Sergeant First Class to you," he replied, a corner of a mouth not given to mirth rising in wry jest only once I'd saluted him. Next to him, Virginia's mother's effusiveness disarmed me. "Well, aren't you just the sweetest thing," she said, and with the hand not holding the bakery container, drew my face to her mounded torso. Though my mother had been pregnant most of the previous year, I didn't know until then how firm the stretched flesh could become. But as my nose pressed against her dress, tulip patterned and smelling of bergamot, I worried she'd break it, and I'd have to tell my parents yet another story they wouldn't believe, however fast I clung to it. Inside, grace was said, our amen in perfect unison. Then Virginia reached for a glazed cruller and her mother swatted her wrist. Guests first, Mrs. Nettle said. And though I would have liked the cruller myself, I chose a Long John with maple frosting. The house was identical to ours, with a dining room and living room off the kitchen. And I found it strange that for a meal consisting of donuts and coffee, we sat at the dining room table, each of us with a plate, utensils, and coffee cup and saucer, when we could as easily have eaten at the smaller table in the kitchen. But I made sure to lay my napkin across my lap, and when I did, Mrs. Nettle complimented me on my manners. Sergeant Nettle wanted to know in which village our neighborhood was. And when I told him Chaffee, he asked, "Your dad medical?" Chaffee was where most of Darnell Army Hospital's medical personnel were housed. I nodded. He's an OBGYN. Mrs. Nettle perked up. "What did you say your name was, sweetie?" When I told her, she swooned. "Your father's my doctor." Sergeant Nettle rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Ray, don't be a sourpuss," she said, slapping the back of his shaved head with her open palm. But when she turned to me, her eyes were shiny and wet. "He's just so wonderful, you know, your father." She daubed them with her napkin, and in her set jaw, I saw Virginia's likeness. I mean, it's hard to find a doctor, one specializing in women's health concerns, who both knows what he's doing and how to make a patient feel good about herself. OBGYNs like your father are as rare as hen's teeth. This wasn't the first time I'd heard this. Mrs. Burnett, my first grade teacher, who lived in the other half of our duplex and whose own baby had been born a month before my brother, had told me that I had to be the luckiest boy alive to have a father who understood women so well. Nor would it be the last. But as awkward as it was to hear his virtues extolled in an area I knew next to nothing about, I was smart enough to accept accolades on his behalf, aware that I could only profit from them. "Why, thank you, ma'am," I said. "I'm sure he'll be thrilled to know you think so highly of him." "Oh, no, you can't tell him," Mrs. Nettle replied. "That would be too weird." "Okay, then," I said, "I won't tell him, but I'm sure he'd be thrilled if I did." "Oh, I don't know," she said. "You decide. I'm big as a barn. I don't know what I think anymore." She took a bite of a Bismarck and cherry filling spewed from it in a glob across her bosom. "Look at me. I'm a mess." "Ginny," said Sergeant Nettle, commandeering the conversation, "would you like to go to your friend's block party?" Virginia nodded, and my heart rose in triumph. I was Sir Lancelot, and she my Queen Guinevere. I was Wilfred of Ivanhoe, and she my Lady Rowena. As Virginia changed out of her Mary Janes and into her Keds, I was David Balfour, and she my Catriona MacGregor Drummond. At Sergeant Nettle's request, I wrote down my address and phone number on a sheet of paper and handed it to him. "You take good care of her, you hear," he said, and I told him I would. Glad these many years later, I didn't kneel. "Come on," Virginia hollered from the street, already on her bike. "Let's go." As I caught up to her on mine, her dress fanned out into tail fins as her hair streamed behind her. Soon we were riding side by side, and I told her about Dr. Hidalgo, his blue 1963 Porsche 911, how parked in his drive it made everything around it spin, and how he'd agreed to set up his RV-8 so that everyone in the neighborhood could look through it at the Sea of Tranquility, where the Apollo 11 lunar module would shortly land, and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would later set foot. "Dr. Hidalgo's cool," I told her. "He and my dad are both OBGYNs at Darnell, both majors, but somehow he gets away with wearing his hair a little longer. I don't know how. And when he comes over for dinner, he always brings a date, and never the same one twice. Mostly they're nurses, but once he brought a teacher. So he's a playboy," Virginia said. "Funny, that's exactly what my mom called him one night when I overheard my parents talking. And you think he's cool?" From the dimple that cupped the upturned corners of her mouth, I gathered she did not. "Cooler than my dad," I said, "but not cooler than yours." "The man you met," she said, "back at the house isn't my dad. My dad, my real dad, is dead." I told her I was sorry for her loss. "How did he die?" I asked. "If you don't mind my asking." "On the ground," she replied, "fighting." When I returned to the house with Virginia in tow, my mother and father stood in front of our new colored Magnavox with Lieutenant Colonel Hall and his wife, who with their 6 kids lived at the top of the crumbling hill of dirt that linked our 2 backyards. On the screen flickered a black and white still of craters against a backdrop of infinite space. Eagle had landed, according to Walter Cronkite's voice. On the dining room floor, my 5-year-old sister Karen sat cross-legged before my diapered brother Kurt, not yet one, trying to interest him in blocks that had been mine before either of theirs. She'd placed one in the willowy stubs that were his fingers. That's the letter A, the color red, the number 1, where his dull eyes would examine it before he launched it afoot, like something he'd coughed up. She'd hand him another. That's the letter F, the color green, the number 6, Karen's assiduity, even then, that of Sisyphus. Beyond the sliding glass doors, flames soared from the 3-legged Martian, otherwise known as our barbecue grill. And on the sideboard, my parents had erected a cityscape of liquors, liqueurs, and mixers, my favorite, the towering yellow spire of Galliano. So transfixed were the adults by the Apollo 11 moon landing news coverage, Virginia and I were, for all extents and purposes, invisible. I led her through the living room and down the hall into the bedroom I shared with my sister, and no one said a word to us. There I showed her my collection of Matchbox cars, placing in her palm an exact replica of Dr. Hidalgo's blue Porsche 911, G.I. Joes, classics illustrated comic books. At the time, I owned about 20, all but one of which had come in the mail. And I rustled through Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson to the page at the back with the order form listing the titles by volume number. Having saved the best for last, I produced from my closet the box containing my Thingmaker oven, bottles of Plastigoop, and metal molds. And when I lifted the lid and unveiled the components, each custom fitted to an indenture in the block of styrofoam, Virginia's eyes widened. Creepy crawlers, she said, as if what had been revealed were the answer to all her dreams, as they had been to mine on Christmas morning. And look, I said, glow-in-the-dark Plastigoop. On the floor was a braided rug on which we sat Indian style before my prized possession. I plugged the metal oven's electrical cord into a wall socket, and while we waited for the Thingmaker to heat to 360 degrees, which was just one of the reasons the toy was unpopular with parents and consumer groups, we squeezed night glow liquid from plastic dispensers into cavities shaped like spiders, centipedes, worms, scorpions, lizards, beetles, and snakes. With waves of heat undulating over the Thingmaker, we set the metal mold into the recess on the top of it, using the safety tongs as specified in the instructions. God, I love the smell of creepy crawlers when they're cooking, Virginia said, closed her eyelids and inhaled the vapors, her face that of one waiting to be kissed. My mother worried that the fumes were toxic. Are you sure you don't want me to open a window, I said. My mother would not have even asked. No, Virginia said, her voice dreamy. I love the fumes. I love them too, I said, and breathed until my nostrils tingled with the greasy redolence of oxidizing polyvinyl. For us, it was an elixir that only improved our productivity, for no sooner had I pried baked creepy crawlers from their mold with the included stick pin that Virginia had refilled it with squirts of Plastigoop. And as soon as I took one mold out of the Thingmaker, Virginia put another one in. God, we're good, she said. And when all the Plastigoop was spent and the products of our labor lay in column formation by species on the rug, we rested on our backs in euphoric exhaustion. Have you ever smoked a cigarette, she asked. Apparently, when I was 2, I ate cigarette butts out of an ashtray, I replied, and had to have my stomach pumped. But in answer to your question, no. I've never actually smoked a cigarette. Have you? No, she said, but I'd sort of like to now. We could pass it back and forth, the way they do in movies. I was intrigued by the idea. My father smoked Viceroys, but said, come on, and sat upright. I have an idea. This wasn't something I had planned, but only seemed natural considering that all the creepy crawlers we'd made glowed in the dark. We'll scatter our creations all over the backyard. Well, they'll charge in the sunlight, and when the sun goes down, they'll glow so brightly the astronauts will see them from space. You think so, she asked. It's worth a try, I said. And we took our creepy crawlers out the back door, stuffed in our pockets and dribbling from our clutches. By then, the block party was in full swing, and men from the neighborhood, all holding cans of Schlitz or hams, huddled around my father as he flipped and basted chicken, while the women, most in floppy hats and sunglasses, sat together in lawn chairs, each with a Mai Tai, Harvey Wallbanger, or old-fashioned. One thing I could say about my neighborhood, though most of the men had been drafted from private practice or straight from medical school, and none of them relished spending 2 years in Fort Hood, Texas. None complained about it publicly. This was reserved for the privacy of the home. And if at times I'd wondered what held my own family together through it all, the atmosphere had improved now that my father's service commitment was nearly done, and we were moving to Minnesota by summer's end. The strange thing was, though my mother had stopped cursing and crying during the day, and my father no longer came home in the evenings incensed by the incompetence and pomposity of medical officers higher ranking than himself, I already missed Fort Hood, the tarantulas that pranced like blind spots across the parched lawns, the fluorescent millipedes as wide as combs that squeezed up through the bathtub drains, the pair of coral snakes I'd found entangled in a discarded Burger Chef bag, and the diamondback that moved so mirage-like through the brush in which I played, I doubted my own eyes until they fell upon the rattle dragged behind it like an awkward piece of luggage, the reticulated segments rows of baby teeth, already tobacco-stained. As Virginia and I covered my family's own parched lawn as methodically as planters sowing seed, dropping a spider here, a beetle there, I already missed her too. When we were through, I asked her if she was hungry, and she said, starved. So we went across the street to the Winfreys for helpings of Mrs. Winfrey's Frito pie, then zigzagged up and down the block, dining as we went. Every home was open to us, and because I'd eaten supper at least once in most of them, I could recommend what was best at each, whether it was Mrs. DeBusk's lime jello with quartered canned pears suspended in it, or Mrs. Spurlock's peach cobbler with its crisp lard crust, or Mrs. Tricky's meatloaf, which she made with A1 steak sauce instead of ketchup. Fed and full, we played kick the can with some of the other neighborhood kids, all of whom Virginia knew from school, and who flashed each other impressed, if quizzical glances when she punched me in the arm or booted me in the shin. These, we all knew, were displays of affection, as clear to everyone as a French kiss, and I was thrilled that she never left my side, even when we were hiding from it, which was what we were doing when Dr. Hidalgo emerged from his house with his magnificent telescope. In Bermuda shorts and paisley knee socks, he looked as if he were carrying a sousaphone, with the mount resting on his shoulder and the dew cap and the bell from which a counter march might grumble. Game over, I called to everyone from our cover behind the Groundlands oleander bush. And when they saw what we saw, they materialized from their havens like creatures entranced. Adults too were drawn to the spectacle, some with kids' arms wrapped around their foreheads and transistor radios glued to their ears, for by then the moon had appeared as a wisp of itself, barely there, but astronauts were on it, and the truth seemed impossible to grasp. As we joined the crowd, Virginia was laughing. When I asked her why, she whispered in my ear, "Dr. Hidalgo isn't a playboy." "No," I whispered back. "He's with a different woman every time he comes to your house for dinner because no woman will date him more than once." Though I knew what she said was true, I pointed between the assembled at his blue Porsche. "What about his car?" I asked. But even it seemed duller than it had the last time I'd looked at it, as if the sun had seared some of the luster from it. She said. "I stand with my mom. Your dad's cooler." "But how do you know? You didn't even meet him." "I saw him with the other men when we were in your backyard. They were all listening to him with bated breath." "And what was he talking about?" I asked. "A patient, a golf ball. That's all I heard, but it was enough to totally convince me." "There," Dr. Hidalgo proclaimed. "She's all lined up and ready for public viewing." As if the moon were an actress or model and he's somehow responsible for how she looked that evening. He'd been born and raised in Argentina, and affectations I'd once thought women had to find charming struck me in Virginia's presence as unfortunate, if forgivable. Clearly, he was enjoying the attention and taking delight in the anticipation each of us felt as we awaited our turns to peer through the eyepiece at a moon that would appear, he kept telling us, 60 times closer to Earth than it really was. "Do you know what a telescope is?" He'd ask each mother, and before she could answer, say, "Nothing but a scientific means of connecting two heavenly bodies. The moon is a heavenly body, and so, my dear, are you." When it was our turn, I said to Virginia, "You go first," praying he'd refrain from the smarm for as long as it took her to see the moon in the 8-inch aperture. And he did. "Wow," she said, "that was amazing. Have a look." As I put my eye to the lens, Virginia placed her hand on the small of my back, and what appeared in the night sky as a slender crescent flat as a clipped fingernail appeared in the dinoscope as an orb, a sphere. You could see its curves, its craters, its lit and shaded edges. I'd looked through Dr. Hidalgo's telescope before and seen the moon when it was full, but on those occasions, it hadn't had people on it. And as I looked at it now, I kept thinking that although it was in space, it was also in Virginia's mind. She had, after all, just looked at it. And I imagined what else I might find if I dared to venture even further into the darkness. I didn't want our day to end, though soon my mother would be calling me to come inside and get ready for bed. I asked Virginia if her mother and stepfather were expecting her shortly. It was too dark for her to ride all the way back to her house alone. And I'd expected all along that Sergeant Nettle would eventually come to get her, her bicycle fitting easily inside the back of his country squire. It was why I thought I'd written down my address and phone number for him. So I was surprised when Virginia replied with absolute certainty, "No one's coming to get me." I didn't understand. "Do your mom and stepdad think you're sleeping over?" I asked. "They aren't thinking about me at all," she replied. "They have too many other worries." "My parents can drive you home," I said. "I'll go inside and explain the situation to them. It'll be easy." "Please," she pleaded, "don't ask your parents to drive me home." She clung to my arm, and even as we walked down my street past windows lit by televisions, in every home someone I knew, the drag was tremendous and unexpected, and I wanted the day to end. But I didn't know how to end it. So for a time, we sat at the picnic table in my backyard. All the neighbors had returned to their homes, and the creepy crawlers we'd sown pulsed in tears of greenish light, faint as the bioluminescent plankton that made the ocean sparkle at night. And in my mind, we were already much, much older. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much for that reading, Dan.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Yeah, we are going to be able to take some questions and maybe have a little bit of a conversation with our audience members. So I wanted to start. Is it okay if I ask a question too?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. So you said at the beginning of your reading that this story began as autobiography. So I wanted to ask you, what do you feel was missing that necessitated treatment through fiction?
Oh, nothing really. In fact, I published the story first as creative nonfiction. That is, I felt as if the memory that I had of Virginia Nettle and me on the day that the Apollo 11 moon landing occurred, I remembered it. Now, I remember there being a lot of people at our home. I could pull back a lot of details just from the memory alone. And then it did get strange at the end of it. Now, whether or not we said everything I put in dialogue, that, I can't know. So there's enough fabrication for me to feel comfortable calling it fiction, even as I know it's based on a real memory. At least I think it's a real memory.
Well, thank you for that, Catherine.
So were her parents' names really the Nettles?
Yes.
I mean, that's just too good.
I know. Her name was Virginia Nettle. I don't remember what her parents' first names were. So if Virginia Nettle happens to be watching, so I think it's highly, highly unlikely. But no, her name was Virginia Nettle. I remember her from my second grade class.
I love the scene where they're making the creepy crawlies and the just delight in sharing that wondrous moment with this young girl. I just loved that scene.
Well, I mean, I do think that it's a detail that might not resonate with all readers. That is, I think those of us who are of a certain age remember the cachet that creepy crawlers had, back in the 1960s and into the 70s. I mean, I was the envy of so many kids in the neighborhood because I had this thing. And it was probably not healthy. I mean, I can remember the toxic smell of the plastic goop as it would go into the molds. And I mean, I think it was probably very dangerous. I feel sorry for kids that don't have toys that, you know, are potentially toxic today. I think that somewhat facetiously, but I do feel as if, you know, children today have been stripped of a lot of freedom that I remember us as kids having. And that's one of the reasons why I became fascinated with this material, because, you know, in the morning, I'd be kicked out of the house. I could do whatever I wanted for the whole day and nobody cared. That simply doesn't happen anymore. I have a 17-year-old daughter, and, you know, I can remember all the play dates I've set up for her, everything being so totally and completely orchestrated. And I feel sorry for her even to this day that she didn't have, you know, the experience of not true freedom, but a greater sense of freedom that I remember having as a kid. Granted, I was a boy too, and girls might not have had as much, but I don't know. It seemed like all the kids in the neighborhood just were free to do whatever they wanted.
We were, yeah, I'm older than you are, but we definitely had a lot of freedom to run around and play in the woods and do, you know, pretty much anything we wanted, as long as we stayed relatively within sight and or within you know, certain confines, and we're home for dinner. But I have a question here from Benny. She says, wow, I can see why you're Wendell's new favorite writer, especially regarding the character development. The details and the scene descriptions are incredible. Thank you so much. I have a sort of chicken and egg question. Do you find that your fiction informs your nonfiction writing, or vice versa? P.S. I'm of that age and remember a lot of those things, LOL.
That's a really sweet question. I don't really make very many distinctions between my fiction and my nonfiction. What I can say is all of the fiction I've ever written has been inspired to some degree by something that has happened to me. You know, one of the things that I tell my students all the time is that, you know, I've really lived a boring life. That is, not that many interesting things have happened to me, but a lot of almost interesting things have happened to me. And those almost interesting things are, for me, the material of fiction. That is, I start to think of things that almost happened, almost as an algebraic equation with variables. And I imagine if you're able to change, you know, any one of those variables, well, then the thing that wasn't all that interesting suddenly becomes interesting. And that's how I approach fiction a lot of the time, most of the time. As I said, I mean, this was published as an essay first. We can call it an essay, but I am trying to also publish it as a piece of fiction now in a collection of short stories. I don't know if that answered her question or not, but I think that's a good way to look at one's life, to be honest. That is, you know, I don't think that many of us have, you know, that many epiphanies in our lives. Not that every story has to have an epiphany, it doesn't. And there are a lot of writers who have written about, you know, not necessarily needing epiphanies in every story. But that said, I would also argue that, you know, fiction writers were all imbued with an imagination, and it's the imagination that can examine, you know, things that were almost interesting in our lives and create stories that hopefully are interesting from that material.
All right, I have another question for you, Dan, and
Yeah.
it's from Nancy. And she wants you to talk about setting with the observation that setting, also time, seem to be characters as well. And she wants to know, does this kind of occur in your other stories? Does this setting occur in your other stories too?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, after my father died, and I'll get to this question about setting in a second. After my father died in 2012, I went into such a spin cycle emotionally, psychologically, that I became worried that my wife would divorce me if I didn't seek help. That is, I was not a lot of fun to be around. And so I did seek help. I went to see a therapist for free at the University of New Mexico. And the first thing the therapist asked me to do, because I was suffering from all of this guilt, that I didn't know from what. And she said, well, I want you to share some memories, some early memories from your childhood. You know, go way back as far back as you can remember. And as far back as I could remember was really ages 4, 5, 6, 7. And I told her, I have no memories at all, nothing that I could access, nothing. Well, that strategy of hers didn't really work, but other strategies did. And I felt that after 8 weeks of meeting with her once a week, I was, slowly but surely getting back to myself, no longer with these erratic mood swings. But after that session was over, I said, well, I do have one memory. And so I wrote it down. And then that connected to another memory. And then suddenly they were like mushrooms popping up in the ground, all connected, underneath the surface, one after another after another. And I spent 3 years just writing stories down from this period of time in my life, when I think my parents were maybe at their least happy together, to be honest. I think it was the pressure of being in Fort Hood, Texas, a place that neither of them wanted to be. My father having been drafted into the Army. My mother, who grew up in born in Tennessee, but raised in Southern California, had no interest in being in what she called the hellhole of Central Texas. But it was funny, this period of my life that I thought I had no memory of, in fact, I did, but there was no way for me to access it until I began writing it. And it took one memory, and then all of these others came one after the other after the other. In answer to Nancy's question, I think Nancy is the one who asked it. I will say that setting plays a major role in every piece of fiction I write. It took me a fair amount of time to realize the importance of setting. But once I did, I've never looked back. And what I will say that I didn't understand when I first started writing is that setting can be a character, no question, but setting can also be a means of characterizing. And so a description, if it's specific, if it's particularized, if it appeals to all the senses, is a way of characterizing a central character in whom that setting resides as memory. So the degree of specificity, let's say, in some description of place, is an indication of how that character sees the world and remembers the world. It's remembered with that degree of specificity. Not everybody remembers the world with that degree of specificity. And so characters distinguish themselves in a way by the description that kind of underscores the resolution of the memory. That was a kind of convoluted way of saying that the setting resides within the character, even as the character resides within the setting, because it's all a memory.
Right, like they're inseparable.
They're inseparable, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, great, thank you. Catherine, did you have another question from the audience?
I have a question from Josie. She says, I loved this story. I'm curious, why was it titled The Way They Do in Movies?
Well, I have I know I have a feeling that the title may give the wrong impression of the story to come, but that doesn't really concern me. I have a theory about titles, and it's half-baked at best. But I think that the best titles have a way of sending a laser beam into the story and hitting a detail that might otherwise be forgotten or dismissed, and illuminating the story from the inside out. So as you'll recall in the story I just read, after we've been playing with the creepy crawlers, Virginia Nettle asked me if I've ever smoked a cigarette, and she wants to smoke a cigarette, and she says, the way they do in movies. I think that most readers would forget that line if it weren't in a way connected to the story by the title. I don't know if it's a good title necessarily, but it's doing what I think good titles do, which is direct that laser beam into the story and illuminating it from something, illuminating it from the inside out by drawing attention to something that might be forgotten otherwise.
Right, and I know, I write poetry, but sometimes titles are really hard to write. You've got to find that organic connection. I have a question from Ryan, and he wants to hear you talk about some tips, I'm presuming for like maybe beginning writers for getting into a story and building up to a book.
That's that in a way, that question is so general. I'll do my best. All right, tips for beginning writers. Well, okay, here is some advice that I tend to give my students all the time, and because I have to give it to myself. And that is that if you have got the conception of something big in mind, that's good. But then you also have to attend to the minuscule. That is, fiction succeeds by drawing attention to the small moments, the tiny things, and putting all of your energy into rendering each moment. And I think that sometimes I know that because I can see the larger architecture of this, large narrative that I'm working on, I can find myself connecting the dots because I need to get from A to B to C to D, and I'm really writing to get to the end. When I discover myself in that sort of situation, I realize I've got to pull back, maybe take a yoga class, calm down, and deeply imagine a fictional world through a character's consciousness, and move slowly, moment by moment by moment, to a crisis point, and then look at what I have and see whether or not it fits the larger architecture of the larger narrative that this will be a part of. The reason why I say this is that I sometimes think that novelists can get so caught up in the larger story that they ignore the smaller one. And I think large stories are composed of really compelling smaller ones that reach their own individual, crisis moments or crescendos, and their rises in actions and falling in action. And slowly but surely, in a novel, it moves to, presumably some culminating event that all of the pieces work together toward.
Thank you.
And I guess, for a beginning writer, I would also say so much of it comes down to trusting yourself. I started writing without a great deal of trust in myself, to be perfectly honest. I found myself as a graduate student in 1988 and 89 at Hollins College in their MA program in creative writing. And I had been teaching high school English in Wausau, Wisconsin. I was a public high school English teacher. And after 3 years of doing that, I applied to graduate programs in creative writing and found myself at Hollins. How I got in, I have no idea. Because once I was there, I realized that everybody was so farther advanced than I was. I was ashamed, actually, to submit my work. When I looked around at the work of my peers, it was all more sophisticated. It was all more deeply imagined. The sentences were better. Everything about their work just made me think that I should quit. And I almost did. That is, about a month in, I said, this is much harder than I ever thought that it would be. Maybe I should just go back to teaching high school English. But then I said, no, I'm here for a year and I'm going to give it all I have. And once I made the commitment to look at the work of my peers and say to myself, okay, I'm not going to be intimidated by it. I'm going to learn as much as I can from the work of others, from my teachers, from my peers, and from every piece of fiction, every piece of literature I read. Right now, I am going to get rid of any ego I have and try only to learn. And that served me well. That is, by the end of that year, I knew that this was what I wanted to do. So by the end of 1989, I knew that writing fiction was what I was going to do forever, but I almost didn't do it. And so my advice, this is probably even better advice than the advice I first gave. Get rid of your ego and really just try to learn as much as you can from everything you read. That's the great thing about literature, is that to study it, it only means that you have to ask the right questions. In literature classes, we don't ask the right questions. I mean, we ask the right questions if what you want to do is derive the meaning of something from a piece of literature. In literature classes, most of them, we ask, what does it mean?
Mhm.
And we can bring all kinds of schools of thought to bear on what it means. And we can get an answer and we can write about that answer. But as a fiction writer, or as any writer, a poet, fiction writer, creative nonfiction writer, the question isn't what does it mean? The question is how? How was it made? And the great thing is there are examples everywhere. All you have to do is ask the question, how was it made? And it will tell you. And as soon as you're able to comprehend what it's telling you, you have got that technique, that strategy, that is yours and you can use. It's why I think that writers have to read constantly. And, you know, as you're asking these questions of everything you're reading, you may not even know what purpose you're going to put it to, but suddenly you're working on a poem or you're working on a story or an essay. And there it is. The story you're working on is demanding that you do something you've never done before. But hey, you've seen it done before. You've never done it before, but you've seen it done before, and you're able to engage with your story in terms of what it wants, rather than you're trying to force it into some conception that you want for it.
Catherine, did you have a follow-up?
I did. Thank you, Dan. I think that's all really, really good advice. I want to take a minute and say, I'm sorry if you guys are hearing a lot of disturbing noise in the background here. We have a lot of military traffic in the background, so I apologize. I can't really control the military.
Kind of perfect for my story.
Exactly, exactly. But I do have a question from Bailey. She says, or Bailey says, I was enthralled by the specificity of your details, such as the specific supper dishes at each house, an example being the meatloaf made with A1 steak sauce. My question is both, how do you choose the details that pop in a piece like this, and how much of the detail is exact memory or an interpretation? I'll just add on to that. I was struck by the description of the telescope, which I'm sure you don't remember from childhood in quite that detail.
No, I don't remember the telescope in nearly that detail. But what I do have is an ad from Classics Illustrated comic book with that, not the R6 telescope, not the R8 or RV8 that the neighbor had. And what you can do, this is what I did do, is that I just looked up the parts of the telescope online so that I could make use of them. Because I do believe that particularity is a way of conveying to a reader intelligence in a character. I always think of Henry James' maxim, you know, I want to write characters on whom nothing is lost. And James may have succeeded in a way that I never will. But what I'm always trying to do is create characters who are more perceptive than me, are more intelligent than me, who live on a higher plane than I do in my day-to-day life. Do I observe the world with that degree of detail? No, I probably don't. I don't know enough to. But when I'm creating characters, I want characters who are able to see with greater clarity than me. That's what keeps me engaged, to be perfectly honest. And I think that there's some artistic justification for doing this because there's such great temporal distance when writing about childhood. You know, time is a refining fire, and it has a way of eliminating everything that is superfluous. That is, only what is necessary usually remains the more time passes. And so artistically speaking, when I'm writing a story with a great deal of temporal distance, I want, in a way, I want to underscore the power of the memory through the immediacy of its rendering. And one way to convey that immediacy is through precision and detail. And I think it correlates, to be honest, with how experiences that for one reason or another we can't forget haunt us. That is, we may not be haunted with a memory that is that precise, but you sit down and recollect what you can remember. You are often astonished, I think, by the degree of specificity and precision. I know that I can remember, for instance, what's in the backyard of our neighbor's house back in Fort Hood, Texas, better than I know what's in the backyard of my neighbor's house here in Albuquerque. That is because I had experiences in my formative years in Fort Hood, Texas. You know, some of those things have become who I am. I can see them more clearly in a way than I can, you know, what happened, you know, backyards of even 10 years ago. So one of the things I'm always telling my students is that, you know, if you need a setting, why not take a setting from, let's say, their 20-year-old writers. I say, take a setting from 10 years ago when you were 10, or 12 years ago when you were 8. There's a reason why you can remember it so clearly. It saves having to make up a lot. And writing fiction is hard. You have to make up a lot already. But if you make use of settings that have been ingrained in your psyche from a long time back, it can simplify the problem of kind of grounding a reader, orienting a reader to a place through precise details.
Right. So I think this question / observation from Scotty kind of follows on the heels of some of your comments about the necessity of including certain details versus leaving them out. Scotty wants to know what particular event, and by this I think he means what was the most central event that you think you were trying to capture in that story, since there were also so many little memories wrapped up in the entire piece?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I know the reason that I wanted to write the story had to do with remembering how frightened I was when I didn't know what to do with Virginia Nettle at the end. That is, she didn't want to go home, and there was nobody coming to get her. And that's what I wanted to convey first and foremost, was how shocking that was, and how unforeseeable it was for me as a child. And I think that in a way, if that story resonates with adults in any way, shape, or form, it has to do, I think, with a way in which we can't know, in a way, what we're getting involved in necessarily when we become intimate with other people. When we become intimate with other people, we know as adults, the older we get, the messier it can become. I think as children, we don't yet know that. And I think that's what I know that that's one of the things I wanted to impart. Also, I feel like we're living in a time that, I don't quite know how to put this. I feel as if now, even more than, you know, when I was writing all of these stories, I think that we need to remember what it was like to be children. And I think that there's a way in which the survival of humanity, I don't want to put too far, I mean, I kind of think that the survival of humanity rests on remembering what it's like to be a child. If we have any interest in preserving the world for our children, or just children for successive generations, I want to believe that, you know, all of those little memories that, you know, are building toward, you know, this bigger one of seeing the moon through the telescope on the day that the astronauts landed. I hope that it resonates in ways that are uplifting. Even as I also recognize that human relationships are dangerous.
Mm-hmm. And complicated.
And complicated.
As a way of moving towards closure in this program, thank you for your insights again. I know that many of the viewers in the audience are also our students, and I know that there are always these questions about revision. So as a working writer, do you have any comments on process in terms of revision?
It's good to have readers you trust. And not readers that are spouses or best friends, readers who are other writers who can be honest with you. It's one of the reasons why workshops work as well as they do. That is, when we're writing something, we are too close too close to it usually to see it objectively, to see it clearly. And other writers can very much help in this process. But if you don't have a workshop and you don't have, that mechanism, you can create it. You can create it by finding out other writers who will, in the interest of helping the piece find its larger audience, help you to see what it needs to be, what it wants to be. I also think time will do that. That is, you can write something, put it in a drawer and pull it out a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years later and see it with much more clarity than you could when you first wrote it. I think that also helps. I'm a great one for finishing stories, thinking they're great, sending them out, and having them get rejected again and again.
Yeah.
At which point I have to say to myself, all right, there's something here I'm not seeing. And I can give it to my wife, who is a writer, and she'll be very honest with me for the most part, or I can give it to writer friends, and I trust them to be able to tell me, what's right or wrong with it. But revision is difficult because we have blind spots. All of us do. And, how we compensate for those blind spots is, the big challenge of revision. And sometimes I think it takes other people to help us see.
Thank you so much. Daniel, before we go, would you just quickly, we have a request from Sherry Reynolds. She wants you to repeat that sentence about how humanity's future depends on the child's memory. Can you just say that one more time?
Oh, I don't know if I can. It was so hard to come up with it the first time.
There was a request.
But I do think that our survival as human beings, I think on some level is contingent upon our remembering what it was like to be children.
Right. Thank you so much again. And thank you to the audience for taking time to be here and to listen and interact with our guests. We hope you enjoyed this program. Please remember to come back at 7 p.m. for our last featured writer of the day, Marcelo Hernandez Castillo. So again, festival access links can be found at odu.edu/litfest. And we'll see you in a few hours.
Thank you so much, Dan. We really appreciate your
Thank you. It
being
was
here,
a great time. Thank you.
taking the time. Thank
Thank
you.
you.